I still remember the exact moment the room went quiet before the laughter began, the moment I realized my daughter-in-law hadn't made a mistake. She had made a decision. It happened in the middle of my granddaughter Chloe's wedding reception, right as the band shifted into a softer tune and the guests were settling into their seats with glasses of champagne. I was standing near the center table, smoothing the front of my pale blue dress, the one I had chosen because it reminded me of something my late husband used to say, that it made me look light like spring. I had spent that entire morning making sure everything was perfect, not just for Chloe, but for the family, because weddings to me were sacred things. They were proof that something we built as parents could still bloom into something beautiful. I had wrapped her gift myself, tied the ribbon twice so it wouldn't come loose, and tucked a handwritten note inside. Something simple, something sincere. I remember thinking, just for a moment, that maybe this would be one of those rare days where everything fell whole again. Then Sophie walked toward me with that bright, effortless smile she always wore in public, the kind that made people think she was charming, generous, easy to love. She held a large glass container in both hands, something I didn't question at first because weddings are full of odd little traditions these days, signature drinks, decorative displays, playful gestures meant to entertain. I even smiled back at her, thinking perhaps this was her way of including me, of bridging that quiet distance that had been growing between us for years. But she didn't stop when she reached me. She didn't say a word. She just tilted the container forward, and before I could process what was happening, 2 liters of chilled, sticky liquid cascaded over my hair, my shoulders, my chest, soaking into the fabric of my dress, clinging to my skin with a cold that made my breath catch. For a second, no one moved. The music kept playing, soft and cheerful, completely unaware. Then came the laughter, uneven at first, scattered, like people weren't sure if they were allowed to react, and then louder, more certain, as if someone had silently given permission. I stood there, the sweetness of the drink filling the air around me, dripping from my sleeves onto the polished floor, and I did the only thing I knew how to do in that moment. I smiled, not because it was funny, and not because I wasn't humiliated, but because I had spent a lifetime learning that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It stays quiet, even when everything around it becomes unbearable. I reached up slowly, smoothing my hair back into place, feeling the damp strands cling to my fingers, and I looked at Sophie. She was laughing now, lightly, as if this were all harmless, as if this were something we would all joke about later over cake and coffee. My son Daniel stood a few feet away, his hand wrapped around his glass, his eyes fixed somewhere just past me, like if he didn't look directly at what had happened, he wouldn't have to acknowledge it. No one stepped forward. No one offered a napkin. No one said my name. And in that strange, suspended moment, surrounded by chandeliers and white linens and the soft glow of celebration, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't even a joke. It was a message. And the worst part wasn't the cold or the stares or the laughter echoing just a little too loudly in the room. The worst part was how carefully it had been placed, right in the middle of a day that was supposed to be about love, as if to remind me exactly where I stood and exactly how invisible they believed I had become. I stayed exactly where I was for a few seconds longer than anyone expected, long enough for the laughter to settle into something quieter, something more uncertain, as if people were beginning to wonder whether they had just witnessed something harmless or something they should not have been part of. And then I turned slightly, careful with every movement, and walked toward the edge of the reception hall where the restrooms were located, my heels making soft, measured sounds against the polished floor, the damp fabric of my dress clinging to my legs with each step, leaving faint marks behind me that I did not bother to look back at, because I had already learned that looking back in moments like these only invites more of the same. Inside the restroom, the air was cooler, still untouched by the music and the voices outside, and I closed the door behind me with a gentle click that felt louder than it should have, as if it marked the end of something I had not yet fully named. I walked to the mirror and stopped, taking in the reflection slowly, not with shock, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as though I had finally caught up to a truth that had been waiting for me for a very long time. My silver hair, carefully styled that morning, now hung in damp strands against my face. The pale blue fabric darkened in uneven patches, the faint scent of fruit and sugar rising from my skin. And yet what struck me most was not the way I looked, but the way I felt, or rather, the absence of what I had expected to feel. There were no tears. There was no trembling. There was only a steady, almost distant calm that settled over me as I reached for a paper towel and began, slowly, to pat the moisture from my face, pressing gently, as if I were tending to someone else entirely. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run for a moment before cupping my hands beneath it, the coolness grounding me, reminding me of where I was, of what had just happened, of what had not been said out loud, but had been made perfectly clear. I had spent years telling myself that the small things did not matter, that a missed call, a forgotten invitation, a seat at the far end of the table, a comment brushed off as humor, were all just part of the natural shifting that comes with time, with new marriages, with different priorities, and I had accepted each of those moments quietly, smoothing them over the way I used to smooth out wrinkles in Daniel's shirts when he was young, believing that if I kept everything neat enough, gentle enough, the fabric of our family would hold. But standing there in that restroom, watching diluted streaks of sweetness disappear down the sink, I could no longer pretend those moments had been random. They had been practice, small rehearsals for something larger, something bolder, something that required an audience. I reached for another paper towel and pressed it against the front of my dress, absorbing what I could, knowing it would never look the same again. And I found myself remembering the morning in unexpected detail, the way the sunlight had filtered through my kitchen window as I tied the ribbon on Chloe's gift, the way I had paused for just a second before leaving the house, checking my reflection one last time, adjusting the collar, thinking not about myself, but about how I would be seen, how I would represent the family, how I would stand there among them and belong. That word lingered now, belong, quiet and fragile, as if it had always been more of a hope than a reality. I dried my hands carefully, smoothing them over the fabric one last time, and lifted my gaze back to the mirror, holding it there, steady, until the woman looking back at me no longer appeared like someone caught off guard, but someone who understood exactly where she stood, and more importantly, someone who had finally stopped trying to stand anywhere she was not truly wanted. I opened the restroom door and stepped back into the reception hall as if nothing had happened, as if I had simply taken a moment to compose myself like any other guest. And for a brief second, the world continued exactly as it had before, the music playing, glasses clinking, conversations flowing in soft, practiced tones, but there was a subtle shift now, something quieter beneath the surface, like a current that could not be seen, but could certainly be felt. A few heads turned, not all at once, not openly, but enough for me to notice the way eyes lingered just a fraction longer than politeness would normally allow, the way whispers moved quickly and then disappeared the moment I looked in their direction. I walked steadily, my posture straight, my steps even, returning to the same space I had occupied earlier, as though reclaiming it without saying a word. Sophie was near the center of the room again, surrounded by a small circle of guests, her laughter light and effortless, her hand occasionally brushing her hair back as she spoke, as if she were still the host of something charming and well-received. When her eyes met mine, there was a flicker, quick and almost imperceptible, not guilt, not quite, but something closer to curiosity, as though she were waiting to see what I would do next, how I would react, whether I would confirm the version of me she had already decided to present to the room. I did not look away. I held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a small, composed nod, the kind one offers across a crowded room, and continued walking. Daniel stood a few feet from her, speaking with one of the groomsmen, his expression carefully neutral, his shoulders slightly tense, and when I approached, he paused mid-sentence, the conversation around him thinning just enough to make space for the silence that followed. He looked at me then, really looked, his eyes scanning my face, my dress, as if searching for something he could fix or dismiss, something he could explain away without having to confront it fully. "Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual, not quite steady, Are you okay?" The question hung between us, fragile and incomplete, and for a moment I considered all the ways I could answer it, all the truths I could lay out plainly, all the years of small, quiet dismissals that had led to this one very public moment. Instead, I smoothed my hands together, the motion familiar, grounding, and met his gaze with a calm that surprised even me. "I am fine," I said, my voice even, clear, leaving no room for interpretation. He nodded quickly, almost with relief, as if that answer gave him permission to return to whatever version of the evening he preferred to believe in. "It was just, a joke," he added, glancing briefly over his shoulder toward Sophie, who had already turned back to her conversation, her smile unwavering. I followed his glance, taking in the ease with which she moved through the room, the way people leaned in toward her, the way she controlled the rhythm of every interaction without ever appearing to try. "Yes," I said quietly, turning back to him. It was very clear. He hesitated, as if expecting more, an explanation, a complaint, something that would allow him to respond, to defend, to negotiate. When none came, he shifted his weight, murmured something about needing to check on the seating arrangements, and stepped away, leaving me standing exactly where I was, but no longer uncertain about anything. I picked up a glass of water from a nearby table, holding it for a moment before taking a small sip, the simplicity of a gesture almost comforting, and let my eyes move slowly across the room, taking everything in with a kind of clarity that had been missing before. The decorations, the carefully arranged centerpieces, the soft lighting, the curated joy of it all. None of it had changed, and yet everything felt different, as though the surface had finally cracked just enough to reveal what had been underneath all along. I noticed then that not everyone was laughing. Not everyone had turned away, that a few faces held something else entirely, something closer to discomfort, to recognition, to the quiet understanding that what had been presented as humor did not quite sit right. And in that realization, something inside me settled into place. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a steady, deliberate awareness. I had spent years adjusting myself to fit into spaces that required me to shrink, to soften, to remain agreeable in the face of things that did not deserve agreement. And standing there now, in the middle of that carefully orchestrated celebration, I understood that the moment had passed where silence served anyone, but those who benefited from it. I set the glass down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table, and lifted my chin slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in quiet resolve, because whatever happened next would not be shaped by what they expected of me, but by what I finally allowed myself to see. I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the rhythm of the room settle around me, the music now a little louder, the laughter a little more forced, as if everyone was trying to move past something that had not truly passed at all. And then, without drawing attention, I began to notice the smaller things, the details that had been there all along, but had not seemed important until now. A pair of young women near the bar leaned close to each other, one of them covering her mouth as she whispered something, their eyes flicking briefly toward me before shifting away again. Not unkind, but not entirely comfortable either. Across the room, an older couple I vaguely recognized from past holidays stood side by side. Their expressions were strained, the woman giving me a small nod that felt less like politeness and more like quiet acknowledgement. It was not the laughter that stayed with me in that moment, but the hesitation that followed it, the slight pause in conversations, the way some people no longer seemed quite as certain about what they had just witnessed. I turned slightly, allowing my gaze to move through the room with intention now. Not searching, not reacting, simply observing. And that was when I saw Margaret Ellis standing near the far end of the reception hall, her posture as composed as ever, her hands folded lightly in front of her, watching everything with a stillness that felt deliberate. Margaret had known me for over 30 years, long before Daniel had even met Sophie, and she had always been the kind of woman who noticed things others chose to overlook. When our eyes met, she did not smile right away, did not wave or call out. She simply held my gaze for a brief second and then tilted her head slightly toward a quieter corner of the room, a gesture so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. I understood immediately. I made my way toward her without hurry, passing by tables where conversations resumed just a little too quickly as I approached. And when I reached her, she greeted me with the same calm warmth she always had, as if nothing about me appeared unusual, as if my presence there required no explanation at all. "Evelyn," she said softly, her voice steady, her eyes kind but sharp in a way that told me she had already seen more than most. "You look composed." There was a pause after that word, one that carried more meaning than anything else she could have said. I allowed myself a small, measured smile. "I am," I replied, and for the first time that evening, the words felt entirely true. She studied me for a moment longer, then glanced briefly over her shoulder in Sophie's direction before returning her attention to me. "That was not spontaneous," she said. Not as a question, not even as an accusation, but as a simple observation, grounded and certain. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not agree, but because hearing it spoken aloud shifted something, gave shape to what had until now been forming quietly in the back of my mind. Margaret continued, her tone low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between us. "I was standing near the bar earlier," she said. "I heard her mention it. Not in detail, but enough. She called it a moment, said it would lighten the room." The words settled heavily, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This had not been a lapse in judgment, not an impulsive mistake dressed up as humor. It had been considered, placed, prepared. I let out a slow breath, feeling the last trace of uncertainty leave me, replaced by something steadier, something far less fragile. "Of course she did," I said quietly, my voice even, without bitterness, without heat. Margaret watched me closely, as if measuring the weight of my reaction, then gave a slight nod, as though satisfied by what she saw. "There were others who knew," she added gently. "Not everyone, but enough." I followed her gaze briefly, noting again the scattered expressions throughout the room, the subtle discomfort in a few faces, the careful avoidance in others, and I understood then that what had been presented as a harmless joke had required more than one person to carry it forward, even if only through silence. I straightened slightly, smoothing the side of my dress once more, though there was little left to fix, and met Margaret's eyes again. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it not just for the information, but for the clarity it brought. She placed a light hand over mine for a brief moment, a gesture of quiet support, then stepped back, giving me space without needing to say anything more. I turned from her then, my gaze returning to the center of the room, where Sophie stood once again at the heart of it all, her laughter unchanged, her posture confident, her world exactly as she had arranged it. But something had shifted now, not in the room, not in the music or the lights or the carefully planned celebration, but in me. The question was no longer whether what had happened was intentional. The question now was what I intended to do with that knowledge. I stood there for a moment longer after Margaret stepped away, letting the weight of what she had said settle fully into place, not as a shock, not as something new, but as confirmation of something I had felt building quietly for years, something I had chosen, time and time again, to dismiss in favor of peace, in favor of keeping the edges of this family smooth and presentable, even when the foundation beneath it had begun to shift. I moved slowly toward one of the side tables, my fingers brushing lightly along the edge of a neatly folded linen napkin before I picked it up, more out of habit than necessity, and pressed it once more against the front of my dress, though by now the fabric had already dried into faint, uneven patterns that no amount of careful tending could truly erase. There was a time when I would have worried about that, about appearances, about how others would interpret even the smallest imperfection. But standing there now, surrounded by soft lighting and carefully arranged flowers, I realized how little those details mattered compared to what had just been made visible in plain sight. My thoughts drifted, not backward in a single sharp motion, but in a slow unfolding, like pages turning one after another, each revealing something I had once overlooked. I saw Daniel as a young boy again, sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration while I stood behind him, gently guiding him through problems he insisted he could solve on his own. I remember the years that followed, the long nights, the sacrifices made quietly, the decisions that were never framed as sacrifices at all, but simply as what a mother does without question. I thought of the first time he introduced me to Sophie, the way she had smiled, polite and charming, her voice warm, her manner effortless, and how I had welcomed her without hesitation, believing that kindness offered freely would naturally be returned. I had adjusted then, in small ways at first, stepping back when decisions were made, allowing space for their new life to take shape, telling myself that this was the natural order of things, that every family changes, that every mother must eventually learn to take a quieter place. But as the years passed, those small adjustments had grown into something else entirely, something less visible but far more defining. Invitations that arrived later than they should have, or not at all. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Decisions made and announced rather than discussed. Each moment subtle enough to dismiss on its own. Each one. Easy to explain away if I chose not to look too closely. And I had chosen, again and again, not to look. Not because I did not notice, but because I believed that noticing too much would create distance, would introduce tension where I had spent so long trying to maintain harmony. I had believed that patience would preserve connection, that silence would protect what mattered most. I folded the napkin carefully and set it back down, aligning it with the others as though restoring order to something that had already been disrupted beyond repair, and I felt a quiet clarity settle over me. Not heavy, not overwhelming, but steady, grounded. What had happened here tonight was not an isolated moment, not a single misjudgment dressed up as humor. It was the natural extension of every moment that had come before it, every time I had allowed myself to be reduced to something smaller in order to keep everything else intact. I lifted my gaze once more, taking in the room with a calm that no longer required effort, and I understood that what I had once called patience had, in truth, been permission. Not given openly, not intended, but granted nonetheless through my willingness to accept less than what should have been offered. And as I stood there, surrounded by celebration that no longer felt like mine, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they expected me to tolerate, but by what I had finally decided I would no longer accept. I let my gaze settle once more on Sophie, not with the quiet hope I used to carry, not with the instinct to understand or excuse, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, as though I were seeing her for the first time without the softening filter I had spent years placing between us, and I noticed things I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge before, the way she leaned slightly forward when she spoke to others, drawing them in, the way her laughter arrived, just a fraction too, quickly, as if it had been rehearsed, the way her eyes moved constantly, measuring reactions, adjusting her tone, shaping the room to fit her comfort. There was a precision to it, something practiced, something deliberate, and I realized that what I had once interpreted as confidence had always carried something else beneath. Something sharper, something that required others to remain just slightly off balance in order to function. I turned away before she could notice the shift in my expression and moved toward the edge of the dance floor where the music had picked up again, a livelier tune now, encouraging movement, encouraging distraction. And for a moment, I simply stood there, watching as couples stepped into rhythm, as conversations resumed with greater ease, as if the room itself had decided to move forward whether or not anything had been resolved. It was a familiar pattern, I realized, not just in this room, but in the life I had allowed to form around me. The quiet insistence that discomfort be smoothed over quickly, that anything inconvenient be reframed as harmless, that the appearance of harmony be maintained at all costs. I had participated in that pattern more than I cared to admit. I had encouraged it, even by choosing silence over confrontation, by convincing myself that grace meant absorbing what should never have been offered in the first place. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, feeling the faint dryness of the fabric against my skin, and allowed myself to consider not what had already happened, but what had been set in motion long before tonight. There had been signs, not just in Sophie, but in the way Daniel had slowly shifted over the years, the way his voice had changed when he spoke to me, the way he began to check himself before answering simple questions, as if measuring his words against something unseen, something that required approval before it could be expressed. I had noticed it, of course. A mother always notices. But I had chosen to interpret it as distance, as independence, as the natural progression of a son building his own life. I had not considered that it might be something else entirely, something shaped, something influenced, something guided by a presence that understood exactly how far to push without appearing to push at all. The thought did not bring anger. It brought understanding, and with that understanding came a quiet sense of finality, as though a chapter one had been trying to extend had already ended without my permission. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and straightened my shoulders, not for anyone else, not for the room or the guests or the expectations that still hovered lightly in the air, but for myself, for the woman who had spent too long adjusting to fit into spaces that did not require her presence so much as her compliance. I glanced once more toward Daniel, who now stood near the edge of the dance floor, his attention divided between the conversation beside him and the movement in the room, his expression neutral in that careful way I had come to recognize, and I realized that whatever bond had once existed between us could no longer be sustained by memory alone. It required something he had not chosen to offer, and something I could no longer continue to supply on my own. The music swelled slightly, the lights dimmed just enough to soften the edges of everything, and I felt a quiet resolve settle more firmly into place. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady in a way that did not waver. I had spent years waiting for things to correct themselves, for understanding to emerge naturally, for respect to return without being asked for. But standing there now, I understood that nothing changes unless something shifts, and that shift, finally, would not be coming from them. I moved away from the edge of the dance floor and toward the gift table where neatly wrapped boxes were arranged in careful rows, each one tied with ribbons, each one representing a gesture of goodwill, of support, of celebration, and I found mine exactly where I'd left it earlier, placed slightly apart from the others, not intentionally, but just enough to feel separate if someone were paying attention. I reached out and rested my fingers lightly on the top of it, feeling the smooth paper beneath my hand, the edges still crisp, the bow still perfectly in place, untouched, unnoticed, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to remember the intention behind it, not the object itself, but what it represented, a quiet offering, a continuation of something I had always believed in. That family was something you contributed to without keeping score. That care was something you gave freely, without expecting recognition in return. I lifted the box carefully, holding it close, and turned slightly so that I could see the room from a different angle, the laughter, the movement, the soft glow of lights reflecting off glass and polished surfaces, and I realized how easily everything could appear whole from a distance. How effortless it was to maintain the illusion of unity when no one looked too closely at what held it together. I began to walk slowly along the perimeter of the room, not toward anyone in particular, but with a quiet purpose that did not require explanation, and as I did, I noticed the small shifts that followed me, conversations lowering slightly, eyes flickering in my direction, then away, as if people were unsure whether to acknowledge me or to pretend that nothing had changed. It did not unsettle me. It clarified things. I stopped near one of the tall windows where the evening light had begun to fade into something softer. The sky outside a muted blend of gray and pale gold, and I held the gift box in both hands, steady, deliberate, as though grounding myself in something tangible while everything else settled into place. I thought of the years behind me, not with regret, not with longing, but with a kind of measured understanding, the choices I had made, the ways I had given, the quiet accommodations I had offered in the name of keeping things intact. And I saw now that none of those things had been wasted, but they had been misunderstood, mistaken for something less than what they were, mistaken for weakness when they had always been a form of strength that simply did not demand attention. I turned slightly as I heard footsteps approach, light but purposeful, and saw Sophie moving in my direction, her expression still composed, still carrying that same easy confidence. though there was something else there now, something more alert, more watchful, as if she had begun to sense that the shape of the evening was no longer entirely within her control. She stopped a few feet from me, close enough that her presence was unmistakable, but not so close that it would draw the attention of those around us. And she tilted her head slightly, offering a small, almost practiced smile. "I hope you are not taking that too seriously," she said, her tone light, her words framed as reassurance, though they carried something else beneath them, something that suggested the outcome had already been decided. I looked at her then, not with the quiet patience I'd shown before, not with the instinct to smooth things over, but with a steady, unwavering calm that did not shift under her gaze. "I am not taking it lightly," I said, my voice even, clear, leaving no space for misinterpretation. For a brief second, something flickered across her expression, not quite discomfort, but not quite certainty either, as though she had expected a different kind of answer, one that would allow her to guide the conversation back into familiar territory. She let out a small laugh, soft, controlled. "It was just meant to be fun," she added, her eyes searching mine, measuring, adjusting. I held her gaze without reacting to the tone, without softening the edges of what had already been said. "Yes," I replied. "I understand exactly what it was meant to be." The words settled between us, simple, unembellished, and for the first time since she had approached, she did not immediately respond. The space between us remained quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she nodded once, a small, almost reflexive motion, before stepping back, her attention shifting quickly to something else, someone else, as though the conversation had reached a point she did not wish to explore further. I watched her go, not with the weight of what had been lost, but with the clarity of what had been revealed, and I adjusted my hold on the gift box slightly, the ribbon catching the light as I turned once more toward the center of the room, aware now that whatever came next would not be shaped by explanation or apology, but by something far more deliberate, something that had been waiting quietly for its moment. I walked toward the center of the room again, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a steadiness that felt entirely my own, the gift box still resting in my hands, its weight no longer symbolic of generosity alone, but of something more precise, something intentional. And as I approached the main table where Chloe and her new husband were seated, I noticed the subtle shift in attention once more, conversations thinning just slightly. A few heads turning, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to register that something was about to happen, even if no one could yet name it. Chloe looked up first, her expression warm, unaware of the undercurrent that had been building throughout the evening, and she smiled as she saw me, genuine and unguarded, the way she had always smiled at me since she was a child. "Grandma," she said softly, beginning to rise from her seat, but I lifted my hand gently, a small motion to keep her where she was, not because I did not want her close, but because this moment was not meant to pull her into anything that did not belong to her. "Stay, sweetheart," I said, my voice calm, carrying just enough to reach her without drawing unnecessary attention. And I stepped closer, placing the gift carefully on the table in front of her, aligning it with the others, though it stood out now in a way it had not before. Daniel was nearby, his posture tightening slightly as he noticed where I had positioned myself, his eyes moving quickly between me and Sophie, who had also begun to turn in our direction, her smile still present, though thinner now, more controlled, as if she were adjusting to something she had not fully anticipated. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers, and allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not to gather courage, but to ensure that what I was about to say would be heard exactly as it was intended, without confusion, without distortion. "Chloe," I said gently, meeting her eyes, "this is for you from me, as I planned." She nodded, her expression softening further, her attention focused entirely on me, unaware that the room around us had begun to quiet, not completely, but enough that the space we occupied felt more defined, more contained. I straightened slightly, my gaze shifting just enough to include both Daniel and Sophie without turning fully toward them. And then I spoke again, my tone unchanged, calm, even but carrying a clarity that did not waver. "I have always believed that what we give to family should come from a place of respect," I said, my words measured, deliberate, each one placed with care, not obligation, not expectation, and certainly not performance. There was a pause then, not long, but long enough for the meaning to settle, for those who were listening to recognize that this was not a casual remark, not a passing sentiment. I continued, my voice steady, and I have also learned that respect is not something that can be assumed. It is something that is shown, or it is not there at all. I did not raise my voice. I did not look directly at Sophie, but I did not need to. The shift in the room was enough, the awareness that had begun to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. Daniel shifted beside me, as if preparing to speak, but I lifted my hand slightly once more, not to silence him harshly, but to hold the moment exactly where it was. So tonight, I said, my gaze returning to Chloe, softening just enough to keep her at the center of what mattered. I am giving you this gift with all the love I intended. I paused, letting that truth stand on its own, before adding, with the same calm certainty, but I will no longer offer anything to anyone who believes that kindness is something to be tested or used for amusement. The words settled into the space between us, quiet, unmistakable, and for a moment, no one moved. The music continued in the background, softer now, as if it too had stepped back, allowing the weight of what had been said to remain undisturbed. I stepped back from the table then, my hands returning to my sides, my posture unchanged, and I met Daniel's eyes briefly, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a clarity that did not invite misunderstanding. Then I turned, slowly, deliberately, and began to walk away, not toward the exit just yet, but away from the center, away from a place where I had once stood hoping to belong, carrying with me the quiet certainty that whatever came next would no longer be shaped by what I had been willing to endure, but by what I had finally chosen to leave behind. I continued walking, each step measured and unhurried, not because I needed time, but because I understood now that leaving was not about escape. It was about choosing the direction of my own life with intention. And as I moved toward the far end of the reception hall, I could feel the atmosphere behind me shift in a way that no longer concerned me. Voices lowering, conversations breaking apart and reforming. The delicate balance of the evening disrupted not by anything I had done loudly, but by what I had finally refused to carry silently. I reached the coat check area where a row of neatly arranged garments hung in quiet contrast to the noise of celebration behind me, and I paused for a moment, resting my hand lightly against the edge of the counter as I allowed myself one final look back into the room. From that distance, everything appeared almost unchanged, the lights still warm, the music still playing, people still moving as though nothing essential had altered, and yet I knew better now, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, not by me, and not by those who had chosen to notice. I spotted Daniel near the center, his posture no longer composed, his attention divided, searching perhaps, uncertain a way I had not seen in him for a long time. And for a brief second, something inside me softened, not enough to undo what had been set in motion, but enough to acknowledge that he too would have to reckon with what had been revealed tonight, in his own time, in his own way. Sophie stood a short distance from him, her movements still controlled, her expression still carefully arranged, but there was a tightness now that had not been there before, a subtle awareness that the narrative she had crafted had not unfolded exactly as she had intended, that something had slipped beyond her reach. I did not linger on that observation. It no longer required my attention. I turned back toward the counter as the attendant handed me my coat, a simple, familiar gesture that grounded me in something real, something outside the carefully constructed dynamics of that room. I slipped my arms into the sleeves slowly, adjusting the fabric across my shoulders, smoothing it into place with the same quiet care I had always given to everything in my life. The difference now was not in the action, but in the understanding behind it. I was no longer preparing myself to return to something that required me to diminish in order to belong. I was preparing to leave something that had already made its position clear. I stepped toward the exit, the doors standing just ahead, tall and unobstructed, and as I reached them, I paused for one final moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. There had been a time when I would have stayed, when I would have found a way to explain, to soften, to repair what had never truly been whole. But that version of me had belonged to a different understanding, one that no longer held. I pushed the door open gently and stepped outside into the cool evening air, the quiet, a stark contrast of the noise I'd left behind, and I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the night settle into something lighter, something clearer. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, still, orderly, untouched by the expectations and performances that had filled the room inside, and I walked toward my car with the same steady pace, my steps firm, grounded, certain. As I reached the driver's door, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle, and allowed myself a final thought, not of what I had lost, but of what I had reclaimed, something simple, something essential, something that had been there all along waiting to be recognized. Respect is not something that can be negotiated in the absence of dignity. And dignity is not something that can survive where it is not honored. I opened the door, slid into the seat, and closed it behind me, the quiet settling in once more. And as I started the engine, I did not look back. In this powerful and emotional family stories narrative, an elderly mother attends a joyful wedding expecting love and respect, only to face a humiliating moment orchestrated by her daughter-in-law in front of guests. What begins as a seemingly harmless prank quickly reveals deeper layers of manipulation, control, and long-standing emotional neglect within the family. Through quiet strength and composed dignity, the mother reflects on years of sacrifice, subtle exclusion, and shifting family dynamics, while the daughter-in-law's calculated behavior exposes a pattern of disrespect hidden beneath charm and social performance. As tension builds, an unexpected ally confirms that the humiliation was intentional, transforming this moment into a turning point where silence is no longer protection but permission. This unforgettable entry in family stories explores themes of self-worth, boundaries, and emotional awakening, as the mother calmly reclaims her voice without confrontation or chaos. Instead of reacting with anger, she delivers a powerful and measured response that reshapes the atmosphere of the entire event, forcing those around her to confront uncomfortable truths. The contrast between celebration and quiet betrayal makes this one of the most compelling family stories, highlighting how dignity can speak louder than conflict. The evolving relationship between the elderly mother and the daughter-in-law reflects a deeper commentary on generational respect, emotional intelligence, and the cost of silence in modern family dynamics. As the story unfolds, viewers are drawn into a realistic and relatable portrayal of internal strength, where every glance, pause, and word carries meaning. This gripping addition to family stories captures the moment when a woman stops shrinking to maintain peace and instead stands firm in her value, leaving behind a space that no longer honors her presence. For those who appreciate deeply emotional and thought-provoking family stories, this narrative delivers a powerful message about reclaiming dignity, recognizing manipulation, and choosing self-respect over forced belonging. Ultimately, this is one of those unforgettable family stories where the quietest voice becomes the strongest, and the most graceful exit becomes the most powerful statement. Character 1. Elderly white woman, age 68. Elegant pale, blue dress, formal wedding attire. Front-facing, portrait calm expression, dignified presence. Natural lighting, realistic skin texture, detailed wrinkles. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie. No illustration. Cinematic realism. American setting. Character 2. White woman, age 35. Stylish wedding guest dress, fitted elegant modern look. Front-facing portrait confident expression, subtle smirk, controlled demeanor. Natural lighting, realistic skin, smooth detail. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie. No illustration. Cinematic realism. American setting.